Hello and welcome. Good evening. In this episode, we are going to summarize the events on the front and we have more information about the bigger events going on behind the front line. That's the mobilization, that's the referendi, and of course the deal with Azov that was done for the prisoner exchange. And we are going to talk about what the consequences of a potential Russian use of nuclear weapons will be. Hello and welcome. Let's start right away. There are reports about Russian attacks against the Pecheny Reservoir, which is here. This is the Seversky Donetsk going through it. And obviously the Russians are trying to flood the Seversky Donetsk like they did with the Inhulets in Kherson. There we have indications that the flooding actually worked and the Ukrainians at least temporarily had supply issues on their bridgehead over the Inhulets. And here the Russians obviously try to repeat that feat. We see the Seversky Donetsk being fairly important as it's here in the south from Izium going this way. So should it flood, the supply lines towards the front line here would be threatened. Potential bridges, potential pontoon bridges would be threatened, and the same here where the Seversky Donetsk is still building the front line. My information is in the latest events, they did not manage to damage the dam of the reservoir yet, but that might not be completely up to date anymore, but at least I haven't found anything. We have repeating reports over the last days of Russian attacks against Kupiansk. Supposedly all of them failed. A few hours ago, I heard some rumors within the pro-Russian sources that supposedly they achieved a success. They captured supposedly everything east of the Oskil and actually reached the river. Some claim they might have even crossed it. But as of now, I see no proof whatsoever. So I guess that's probably more fantasy within the pro-Russian Telegram. As said, no proof yet. Just a rumor, and we might see more to come out of that soon. The pro-Russian Telegram is also saying the Ukrainians crossed the Oskil close to Dvorichna, and are now fighting at Tavilsanka, which is here and here. So supposedly they're crossing the Oskil north of Kupiansk, likely to threaten the supply lines, the Russian lines of communication towards the Russian front right at Kupiansk. But we have no visual proof of that either. At least I have none, and I have not seen any, and I haven't heard that there is some. There are continuous attacks on Liman. The Ukrainians have actually, the reports indicate and the images show that they have entered Liman in the north west or the west. They are still threatening there. The operations there are likely to fix the Russians in place, so they stick in Liman and can't redeploy. At the same time, the Ukrainians try to bypass Liman, mostly in the north and northwest. We have to basically force the Russians to withdraw through the threat of encirclement. The Russian the reports show that Ritko Dub and Karpivka are very likely in Ukrainian hands. That's up here. And as we can see, that's basically more or less the, what is that, 0526, that line of communication from Liman, north to Svatove. In this case, all that would be left is the road east here, which is, as of now, doesn't seem to be threatened. But if the reports are through, we can probably expect an evacuation of Liman within the next week or so, maybe 2 weeks, depending on how fast the Ukrainians continue and whether they're actually able to continue. I would not expect a frontal assault, a serious one on Liman, as the urban center will cause unnecessary casualties. The easiest way is to just bypass it and force the Russian to withdraw, which has turned out to be a very popular tactic in this war to avoid urban combat whenever it's possible. According to the reports, there's not much activity in this area, but we have reports of Russian attacks in the direction of Bakhmut. Both Zaitsev as well as Odradivka are supposedly have been attacked. Now, I wasn't sure. In the past, I talked about Zaitsev here, but there's actually a second one down here. So I can't really say whether it's here or here. That one, at least, those attacks might have been here, because while I can't find Odradivka on the map, supposedly it's a suburb of Horlivka, so it should probably be here that those attacks are still going towards Bakhmut. Again, the pro-Russian Telegram are issuing new rumors that the Wagner mercenaries have reached the outskirts of Bakhmut, and supposedly the Ukrainians have withdrawn further into the city. I have not seen image proof there. I see images of a bridge that's being destroyed, but that doesn't look like it's inside of Bakhmut. So wherever that is, so far it's only rumors, but they might have reached the outskirts of Bakhmut itself. Here again, I would expect, at least until the freshly recruited reserves are appearing on the front line, I would not expect the Russians to go into bloody house-to-house combat, which creates unnecessary casualties. I would expect them to try to bypass here as well. In Donetsk, we have the almost usual attacks around Avdiivka, basically in that whole, like a crescent here. The old same tactic I just talked about as well. Avdiivka is, as it has been on the front line on the contact line since 2015, is heavily fortified, so frontal assaults would be unnecessarily bloody. So the Russians try to bypass it and force a Ukrainian withdrawal, as it's done at Bakhmut and Liman from the Russians and Ukrainians respectively. One last report is of a Russian attack at Novomykhailivka. Down here, no reports of it having been any successful. On the southern front, we have some interesting news. The SBU, that's the Ukrainian intelligence agency, says its special forces have entered Russian occupied territory and to destroy material. There is one video of some special forces guys which seem to be in Enehodar, and the specialty is that the sign is using Russian letters. So we know that it's a Russian street sign and a Russian sign that shows the place, and the Russians have probably already exchanged the street sign there. I cannot say when it was made, and I'm not even sure it's in a complete direct connection, but the occupation administration of Zaporizhzhia said on the 23rd of September, a unit that meant to sabotage, probably a commando unit has crossed the front line at Polohi here, and has advanced in the direction of Rosivka. So here, and they were on their way with light off-road vehicles. This is serious. So this seems to be a serious report, because they actually offered a reward in case of helping to catch them. And supposedly they have not been caught yet, which would indicate the Ukrainians actually just raced through the front line at some point and went into the hinterland of the Russian forces here, and are likely still there, because I have not found a report of them having been captured. We have a few informations about the Zaporizhzhia power plant. The IAEA is trying to set up a safe zone, and they are currently negotiating with both Russia and Ukraine, likely, I guess, for a demilitarization of the area. But at least I have not seen information that this attempt was successful as of now. On Kherson, we have reports about Ukrainian attacks on the logistics, on bridgeheads, on river crossings here on the Dnieper and on the Inhulets, and on command structures. There are a lot of images to prove that, videos, etc. But in the end, it's I usually skip that because it's not that important whether the how many ammo dumps have actually been destroyed, and in detail it's often not possible to verify it. What I can say that there are strong indications that the Ukrainians keep pounding the rear areas of the Russians here, which is not that much of a surprise as they keep being stocked up with Excalibur precision rounds and HIMARS GLMRS. The Ukrainians still basically keep their mouth shut when it comes to their operations here. All they said is that the Russians are trying to recover positions that were lost by the Russians before. Apart from that, I have actually not a single proof of serious combat activity. Along the whole front line, we have artillery, and not just in Kherson, basically all over Ukraine. Artillery fire on both sides, mostly reported from the Russian side, but obviously the Ukrainians respond here. So the last days must have been more or less calm in Kherson. That doesn't mean the fighting is not going on, but at least I cannot report any serious attack that was reported that I could verify in any way, and it doesn't seem that any ground has changed position. The New York Times was reporting Putin personally has ordered that the Russian forces are not allowed to withdraw over the Dnieper, which was apparently intended by his military. So he gave the order which forbid the intended withdrawal on the other side of the Dnieper. So before I reach, and that's actually it, what I have from Kherson. So before I talk about the additional informations about the mobilization, let's quickly do a summary what was going on here. Kherson, the goal of the Ukrainians, in my book, seems to clearly show they are trying to do an intentional attritional battle to raise the supply usage of the Russians here, which have limited ways or reduced ways to supply them after the bridges have been taken out. They have to use ferries, easy to damage pontoon bridges and helicopters, which in the end will allow the Ukrainians, might allow the Ukrainians to increase their supply usage to a point where it's higher than what can be supplied, and thus would over time degrade the fighting capability of the Russians, and thus hopefully for them at some point allow to reach the Dnieper and reconquer Kherson. In the Donbass, the Russians are still attacking, occasionally with small successes, but without anything close to a breakthrough. And none of that here seems to be a strategic target of bigger value. In close to Donetsk, it seems highly likely that it's motivated for political reasons, as the front line is so close to the administration of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic. But further north towards Bakhmut, I mean, Bakhmut is a transport hub and it's kind of important, but it's not the breakthrough that will win the war, even though it might push back the Ukrainian defensive line closer to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. What we see here, we still see Ukrainian offensive activity, but far from any breakthrough that we've seen west of the Oskil. The Ukrainians are settled on the left bank of the Oskil here in the east, but apparently also no breakthrough anywhere close. We don't have any serious news about how well the supply run over the Oskil works here. So the Ukrainians are on the other side, but also not too much activity, even though the initiative still is on the Ukrainian side, far from any breakthrough. And even the size of the battles there, I can't really confirm how big those have been. That's more or less it. So actually not that much activity to a bigger degree. It seems like both sides seem to take kind of a breather, though, obviously, despite still people losing their lives. So all of this has to be seen in perspective, but I don't have reports about any serious big offensive activity that actually gained any ground. We have more information about the mobilization within Russia, though. There have been attacks on several recruitment offices and administration buildings all over Russia. For instance, in Nizhny Novgorod, St. Petersburg, Tolyatti, and Sabailkalsky Krai. There have been attacks, most likely with Molotov cocktails. So there is some dissent within Russia, which actually leads to violence here. But we have reports from anti-war protesters that were arrested in the demonstrations. And instead of putting them to prison, they were being served a recruitment notice right in the bus, like right at the moment where they were caught and arrested from the anti-war demonstrations. This shows that the morale we can expect from the Russian fresh reserves should be far worse than the morale that the Russian soldiers had so far. And since the war began, we basically talk about morale issues on the Russian side from the beginning to the end. And to imagine that an anti-war protester is being put in uniform and sent to the front line, you can imagine how well he's going to fight, how high his combat value will be. This also shows that the Russians don't really seem to be interested in setting up a professional force with their reinforcements, but rather that they want to create the mass and forces to force a decision. There are numerous reports which show a complete chaos within the recruitment. For instance, I've seen a report that a 67-year-old supposedly was served a recruitment notice from the reserve offices that he was supposed to appear. 67, despite the top age legally being at 55, and supposedly he also has several chronic diseases, so he's far from being able to fight, but he was still called up, and if you don't show up, you are being threatened with 10 to 15 years in prison. Military specialists are being reported to be set into positions where they have never served before. We can probably imagine this to be like a radar technician now suddenly being sent to the infantry or to the artillery, but nowhere close to what his actual specialty is. And despite the proclamations by Putin and Shoigu, despite both of them saying whoever is being taken out is being excluded from recruitment, all of those groups are still being recruited. That's workers within the military industry. So while they are actually suffering shortages and problems within their equipment, they are still taking away workers in that industry. Putin himself said students don't have to worry. We have a video from Buryatia where another student videotaped Russian soldiers appearing and taking away students to be recruited. And there are other examples, for instance, that several examples where Russian men made a video of themselves and uploaded it to social media while sitting in the bus that drove them to a collection point, saying they were just being served recruitment papers and being picked up while never having served in the armed forces before. Putin and Shoigu said only veterans and only veterans actually with combat experience are supposed to be recruited. And still we have reports about basically grandpas outside of any reasonable usage in the military, as well as completely civilians without any military at all being pulled into the armed forces. All those declarations are in contrary to the facts, which will harm the Kremlin and the defense minister's reputation and will discredit them and whatever they say even further. But this is far from being all. What we see here are examples of the equipment they are being served. And what you can see here is very likely an AKM. Now, supposedly the Russian AKs, the Kalashnikovs, are extremely sturdy. But you see he can't even fully open it. He can't pull back the lock here. And this is not just one video. We have several of them. Always AKMs, so that those are guns that were starting to get out of service in the 70s when they were replaced by the AK-74. And you can see the shape, like they seem to have been buried in a lake since then. And it's the same here. You see the rust everywhere.
Но могу сказать лишь одно, что вроде как это дано, что вспомнили руки. Ну и то я в ахуе.
Now we need to put this into some perspective. We have videos of three different videos, all likely AKM. It might very well be that it was one unit that was given those weapons which were improperly stored. That doesn't mean the other units can't be properly equipped. Then, because the other thing is the Russian army switched to AK-12. I'm pretty sure it's not fully switched to the AK-12, but they were replacing their former AK-74M rifle that was in usage. So there should be a big stock of fairly fresh, fairly unused, or fairly recently in use and thus likely maintained rifles available, not the AKM. But it would be, we can see it as a potential for a much bigger recruitment than is actually planned, that they have to grab those. But it might also be the option that this is a specific place, one specific unit. All 3 videos might be from that one unit that was just given bad weapons, and they might receive better ones. And the third thing is, we shouldn't forget that like AKs are supposedly famous for being how robust they are. They might still work, actually. But what is highly unlikely is that they will have the same reliability. They might have catastrophic failures fairly soon. They might break down and stop firing. And even if they keep working, the accuracy from those guns will likely be fairly horrid. But again, this is just 3 videos that we can't really say to what degree, but we have further informations. Now, there are 16,000 supposedly being recruited in Moscow, which has 12 million inhabitants. So 0.13% of Moscow's population has been recruited now as reserves. And all the time there are reports that basically Buryatia is basically wiped from its male populations. We have examples here. This is a German translation. Unfortunately, I have no idea how to turn this into English, but I can tell you what it says. It says a special town, a specific town, like that. The name of it is Kurumkan, has a population of 5,500, and out of those here, 5,500, and out of those 700 were being recruited. If you calculate it down to roughly the half of it being men, that means that more or less 1/4 of the male population has been recruited in that one town. There is a telegram here. It's an Armenian telegram that says in Tuapse, in Krasnodar Krai, 90% of all people mobilized are supposedly ethnic Armenians, while ethnic Armenians are only 8.5% of the population. Just before I started the live stream, I saw a report of a specific town in Buryatia as well, where there have been 55 male inhabitants living, and all of them were supposedly being recruited. Also, a member of the Russian Human Rights Council, that is an institution that is not independent, but it's actually set up by the Kremlin. Kirill Kabanov said he recommended that every Central Asian immigrant who got the Russian citizenship within the last 10 years should be sent to the armed forces mandatorily. Everyone from Central Asia. All of this indicates that the Russian armed forces put an extreme emphasis on ethnic minorities. And it even led to the former president of Mongolia, who obviously has chosen sides, saying that the Buryat Mongols, Tuva Mongols, and the Kalmyk Mongols are being recruited and basically used as cannon fodders. And he was also saying, like, no dictatorship is going to last forever. And we shouldn't forget, those are basically Mongols. They are just on the other side of the Russian-Mongolian border. There seems to be stronger and stronger indications that Russia is focusing its recruitment on ethnic minorities, both in the Caucasus, Dagestan, for instance. I talked about it in the last status report, and here on the Mongolian minorities, ethnic Mongolian minorities. It has to be seen in some perspective, at least. It is said that those minorities have a higher participation within the armed forces, as living inside of a poor oblast inside of Siberia. It's the best way to socially elevate yourself. So the amount of inhabitants of those oblasts that have served will be higher than, for instance, in Moscow. But the discrepancy seems to be extreme otherwise, which then has to be put into some perspective. It seems like Russia might actually fight its demographic change, whereas the ethnic Russians are having few children and the minorities have many. It seems to fight this, and the reduction of the Russian majority in percentage. There seems to be some indication that they actually want to try to fight this by using minorities as their foremost cannon fodder before they use ethnic Russians. It's reached a point where Ramzan Kadyrov, basically the leader of the satrapy in Chechnya, the leader of Chechnya, he said Chechnya is not going to participate in the general mobilization because it has already reached its intended pensum, its intended goal, and it has actually surpassed it by 254%. He said that on Chechen television, but which would actually show that Ramzan Kadyrov, who has been one of the foremost advocates of this war, one of the most radical propagandists, one of the most radical voices, he would rebel against the recruitment policies from Moscow. And this should not be underestimated, what that actually means. But at the same time, we also have some pictures supposedly from right now, from Chechnya, which shows hundreds, like in huge crowds of young men supposedly volunteering to be taken into the armed forces now, as mobilization is called. Now we need to find some explanation why those masses suddenly appear when mobilization is called, but when Ramzan Kadyrov weeks ago, months ago, was always calling for volunteers, they didn't appear, which at least to me would indicate that it's somehow made up, that it's somehow instigated by Kadyrov, but I have no proof for that. It's just some weird. We have in other places, we see brawls, we see recruits insulting the recruitment officers, etc. So it's definitely not completely one-sided in one or the other way. And even those videos, we have a couple of videos. It's not like I have 1,000 of those. We see 1,000 of those videos where brawls happen, where people are fighting each other. To the degree people are unhappy with the mobilization, to the degree the recruits are actually fighting back, I think it's far too early to actually make final judgment about this. But in general, every commentator outside of Russia and every Russia specialist says Putin, with this mobilization, has basically broken the Russian social contract. The Russian social contract, which was in the past, you let us, the government, get rich through corruption, obviously, but we leave you alone and we leave you do your own thing on the other hand. By taking his soldiers into that war he started, he has obviously broken that. And by focusing on minorities, it seems that Russia might face the danger of separatist movements as soon as it becomes too obvious that the Russian government is trying to avoid casualties among ethnic Russians. Even the most loyal minority will start questioning itself whether its future actually should lie within the Russian Federation when it is being used as cannon fodder. So that might be a serious threat being artificially built right now within the Russian Federation, and when it comes to the coherence, to the cohesion, that's it, within the Russian Federation. The reports or / rumors are the mobilization is supposed to be done by the 10th of November, so in less than 2 months. And it's even becoming bigger, because I already in the last situation report, I said that that there are rumors and some indications that the mobilization might actually reach 1 million people. The latest rumors now are that it's actually 1.2 million people. The indications now seem to show that 300,000 will likely actually be surpassed from the open source data that I found, but we are far from a point where we can confirm that it's actually going to reach 1 million or even cross 1 million with 1.2. The Russian government has a clear intention of lying to the public here, to everyone, to the international audience, because a mobilization of 1 million shows a far bigger weakness than just 300,000. To the domestic audience, as it shows the situation is far better than it might actually be. And by calling for a mobilization, they found the justification while neighbors are disappearing or why neighbors are being called up. But in a country this size, with control of the media to that degree, to actually know the real number of called reservists would probably require you to sit inside of the defense ministry and actually having the full informations. So as of now, we don't have any serious informations. We have the Russian government openly declaring it's 300,000, and depending on where you listen to the opposition, it is the actual number will be 1 to 1.2 million. But when you see the measures of recruitment, the measures of how the government is acting, it's not only disorganized, but it increasingly shows an indication that there is not even an attempt to create a proficient fighting force. Both by the fact that some of them are being sent to the front line fairly right away, then secondly by the people that are being recruited by civilians that have no military experience, by dedicated anti-war protesters. One can imagine their morale once they enter fighting. And all of this indicates increasingly that Putin's government actually wants to create a mass army that is not going to win by its high capabilities, by its high training and the individual soldier, but they just want to roll over Ukraine with human wave attacks and just stomp them to the ground with their sheer mass. All of this is, by the way, happening in a country with a fertility rate of 1.5, whereas this is the overall fertility rate. It doesn't even include the ethnic Russian yet. And we have populations like in Chechnya or in Dagestan where there's still a healthy population growth, where mothers still have 3 to 4 children, which shows that the number of children among the ethnic Russians is even worse than the 1.5 indicated here. And starting a mass mobilization war where you don't even intend to create a proficient army, but where you want to send half-trained to untrained men into the enemy's fire, while your population is already massively shrinking and you're facing demographic collapse, seems suicidal. But the best thing is that's not even all yet. We are coming to the referendi. I think referendi is the plural, isn't it? Referendums? Maybe. I don't know. So we have reports there that the occupation authorities in some points have forbidden the population to leave the area. They are in some regions only for men, in some for all. This shows that they probably want to boost up the numbers and claim that their claimed participation is somewhat more credible, and that if only men are banned from leaving it, that indicates that they will likely try to press all of those Ukrainian men right after the annexation has been signed off by the parliament and the Russian president, so by Putin, that they actually will try to force the Ukrainian men into the Russian army and throw them against the Ukrainian army. In the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, that's here, there are reports that actually children starting at 13 are being allowed to vote. And in Ukraine, we have reports of groups of collaborators going house to house, room to room, basically apartment to apartment, knock, and with armed escorts, masked armed escorts. And when people are denying to open, they threaten to break open the doors and force people to participate in the election. And that is obviously done at the entrance door without any protection to give some privacy for the vote. While there are masked Russian soldiers or Wagner mercenaries right next to the collaborating election aides, which again would indicate how free that election is going to be. Inside of the election offices, there are no booths. So if you go there to vote, you have to make your cross on the paper in front of everyone else. There's no privacy again. And there are also reports that people being caught on the streets are being forced into those election offices to vote. And whoever finds the courage not to to vote yes, so to vote no, is supposedly being written down and registered as by the Russians in those election campaigns. But we also have an example here. Vorgonzo, that's Semen Pegov. I think it was mostly in the German channel. I mentioned him again and again. So he's a propagandist for the Russians, running his own Telegram channel, participating with the Russian forces, wearing their insignia, etc. And he is actually showing himself here to vote in Donetsk, despite living in Smolensk. So not even from Ukraine, not even living in Ukraine, still voting for the annexation, showing that Russian citizens can actually vote whether Ukraine should become a part, or parts of Ukraine should become a part of Russia. Russia has also opened election offices inside of Russia to allow the so-called refugees to vote. Often they have been deported from Ukraine. And supposedly those election officers should help them to vote for the annexation as well. And as they are within Russia, faking the election, falsifying it is obviously even more easy, as it's very easy to slip in pre-prepared election papers, the paperwork this way. But Putin is creating himself more problems. The Russian nationalist groups, basically the community of the Russian nationalists, ultra-nationalists, those who watch the war, are absolutely outraged for the prisoner exchange I mentioned in the last video. Russia declared that the so-called denazification, so basically getting rid of the government, but especially of Azov, which they used as the threat, as what is the word? Like the word, not scapegoat, like the guy you scare people with for the whole time since 2014. They captured a good part of them in Mariupol. Capturing them, taking them out was one of the stated reasons to fight this war. Russia claimed it to be a casus belli. And now its leaders and many of its soldiers have been exchanged in a prisoner exchange, but not just against 55 Russian soldiers, but against Viktor Medvedchuk, who is a Ukrainian oligarch, but a personal friend of Putin. And at the same time, he's the godfather, I think the godfather is the word, of Putin's daughter. So he took Medvedchuk out of a Ukrainian prison where he wasn't even threatened with the death penalty. So he had to be saved within time. No, the worst he might have faced was a decade or something in prison. He was threatened by imprisonment. That was all. And for that, he let according to the Russians, the Nazis from Azov go. And Putin himself in the past reintroduced the adoration celebrating Stalin. Stalin was reintroduced as a big leader of Russia, of the Soviet Union, and Stalin's son was caught in World War II, and where Germany tried several times to exchange him for German prisoners of war within Russia. Stalin refused every single time until Stalin's son committed suicide inside of a concentration camp by running into a high voltage wire, killing himself. So Stalin had the strength to deny his own son's freedom inside of a war, and Putin wasn't even able to allow a friend to stay in Ukraine, in a Ukrainian prison, when he had several hundred of the so-called Nazis within his grasp, ready to punish them, to execute them, to denazify them. This shows that he's interested in personal gain, in his personal well-being, and not in the bigger picture. Obviously, his reputation within the nationalist community is taking a big hit, and we hear Kadyrov again talking about this, where he is attacking it vehemently and is calling it uncalled for, and he is actually implying that from now on, when the Russian soldiers capture Nazis, meaning Azov or other nationalists, they better should be executed to prevent further prisoner exchange, while also implying that Chechen troops have been complicit, have joined in torturing those Nazis while they were while they were Russian prisoners of war. So after lying to the Russian national community about the mobilization, he's now losing even his radical supporters, the ultranationalists, by basically spitting them in the face and telling them whatever we told you about the national threat, about the Nazis, was complete fiction. We just made it up to have something, and we let those evil guys go because we have somebody there who is a billionaire and that we want to save. We should also talk about the potential use of nuclear weapons. I talked to Ukrainians, and I watched an interview by the Ukrainian ambassador within UK, and everything indicates that the Ukrainians basically stoically just prepare. They prepare for the eventuality, but it's not expected that they will back down at all. They will just continue going and wait what is coming. In general, the majority thinks it's not going to happen, but it definitely is a distinct possibility. Should Russia use nukes, though, it'll turn itself to an even bigger pariah than it already is, and will make allies move away from itself. If Russia is starting to use nuclear weapons in an offensive war, not just for defense, but in an offensive war, this shows that Russia is breaking the very last taboo that it hasn't broken yet. After starting an offensive war to annex territory, it would also use nukes to allow for that annexation, which would mean that every nation that feels the slightest threat from a nuclear armed power will have no choice. If it doesn't have the absolute guaranteed nuclear protection by one of the existing nuclear powers, there will be no choice but to get nuclear weapons yourself, as the implied guarantee that nuclear powers will not use their nukes unless their mere existence is in danger has been rendered void with a Russian nuclear attack. As of now, we see China and India still both trying to keep good relations with Russia. China both for political reasons, basically, Russia is the enemy of our enemy, and India mostly because India is dependent on Russian military technology to even keep its military going, which is threatened by both Pakistan and China, who have an alliance with each other, and because it needs cheap energy resources, gas and oil, to grow its economy, and Russia is an ideal source for it. Both would very likely turn away from Russia in case of an offensive use of nuclear weapons, and because we can just imagine what China might think if that would lead to Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Taiwan getting nuclear weapons themselves, as it has proven. Once Russia uses it, the only protection that might exist from the usage of nuclear weapons would be to have nuclear weapons yourself. And if Russia breaks that taboo, it will cause tremendous trouble to the last remnants of soft power it still has. So what we see right now is Russia, you could almost say that Putin is actively trying to undermine Russian future as far as he can. Every one of these points is showing that he attacks his legitimacy. He's deliberately creating separatist movements. I have not heard about specifics yet, but it can only be a question of time if only half of what we hear is true. And at the same time, he's risking the last bit of support he still has. When the UN Assembly voted on whether the Ukrainian president's Zelensky was allowed to speak via video, which is uncommon, usually not allowed. There were only 7 votes against, and I'm pretty sure I can't recall all of them, but that was Russia, North Korea, Cuba, Nicaragua, Eritrea, Belarus, and one more. I'm not even sure it was China. I don't think it was China, but I'm not completely sure. And those are the few real allies. Syria. I don't think I've mentioned Syria. Those are the few last allies that Russia still has, and it's highly unlikely that the majority of those would even abandon the Russian flag once Russia uses nuclear weapons. The last message I have here is that we now have from the Ukrainian state television, as far as I know, that's their foreign television service, should be state-run. It says that the Archer is now in use within Ukraine. We have a short video. Unfortunately, I don't have the full video. but it shows that the system is fully automatic and has a high rate of fire while the crew stays in the armored compartment. And we see here the time while the shells are in the air. And I think either all or the majority of the shells are still in the air when the Archer takes starting to drive off again. So counter battery fire is close to being impossible against it. It's now also in Ukrainian usage. That was it for now. I'm going to take a quick break. I'll use it to play an ad while I drink something, and then we can start with the question and answer. I'll be right back. Okay, and as a lot of you have been here with the last disaster we had in the stream, I'm going to show you the culprit. There he is now, paid for by the German chat. So if you like cats, praise the German chat. If you don't like cats, if you can't take 10% of the screen being filled by a cute cat, so that's your problem, not mine. What new weapon equipment do you think would Ukrainian army probably need most at this stage of the war? I don't think there's that easy a question which is the one fits it all. They basically need everything. Obviously, giving them 400 F-15 Strike Eagle would make a difference. It's just impossible. And starting with that 400 Strike Eagle are not available for transfer. And secondly, that the Ukrainians don't have the pilots for it, and training new ones would take a lot of years. In Germany, after 3 years, you're a military pilot, but your training continues in the unit. So likely there you can call yourself more or less proficient probably after 4 or rather 5 years. What they would need, they need tanks, they need infantry fighting vehicle, they need artillery, both towed as well as self-propelled. They need air defense system, they need drones for reconnaissance. They need long-range artillery, cruise. They could use cruise missiles to. I don't think it's that easy. If it's not that easy. They need everything more or less. Some Iranian drones are hard to detect on radar and had some success. What does Ukraine have to shoot down these drones, and what countries have anti-drone weapons that could help Ukraine? The drones I have actually seen are not that threatening. The Shahid 136 is fairly slow, and the videos we've seen, they are flying fairly high. We're talking about 300 meters, more or less, I guess. Ukraine had, before the war started, several hundred Shilka. ZSU 23-4, I think, is the technical description. That's a self-propelled anti-air gun, 23 millimeters, quad 4 barrels. The radar system is fairly old, but it should be on shorter range able to see it. The problem is if the drone is fairly small, it will by itself have a small radar cross-section. And if that one is too small for the surveillance radar, it might slip into the dead angle of a local air defense system for it to be seen. So Shilka would basically need to be prepared. It would have to know from which direction the drone comes, and in worst case, at least during the day, that could just be done by spotters with binoculars. In worst case, you have to have enough civilians that want to participate and just stare in the sky. Nighttime, it would obviously be more difficult, but those drones are neither small nor have I seen them trying to evade a lot. They are just something new, and all that's needed is some some AAA that actually hits them. Obviously, a system, 40 millimeter Bofors system with proximity fuses would be the most efficient. But in general, a Shilka should be able to handle it. The question is, where are there Shilkas? We've seen in Donbass that the Russians captured a huge depot filled with anti-air systems that were supposedly there for maintenance or seem to be mostly out of commission. And I'm pretty sure those Shilkas there were on those lists of supposedly active systems. So how many of those do they have left? But the drones don't seem to fly much evasive maneuvers. They are fairly slow and they don't fly at 10 meters altitude. So they are hard to fight. I think in general it should be more or less possible with AAA. That is accurate enough. Who could give it to them? It's fairly easy. The Swedes have a lot of 40 millimeter with proximity fuses. Other than that, whoever has Shilka flying around, Gepard should help. The question will less be the fire control radar. That should be more or less able to track them once they are spotted. The problem will be more the spotting, where they might actually be too small to be seen on long-range surveillance radars. But that can be, in worst case, that can be helped with World War II technology. Mark I eyeball and big illumination spotlights in worst case. So I don't think that's what I've seen so far doesn't impress me too much. It's a new threat and it's an unpleasant threat, but nothing of that indicates that this is the frightening thing whatsoever. What I've seen can definitely be defeated. You just have to bring the tools. Who has anti-drone weapons? Specifically, several countries are developing them. I think the Israelis should have some. But I think the Americans are also having some. The question is to what degree are they already introduced, and do they reach high enough for that? So there are several non-kinetic versions, but they all have limited ranges. I think here the easiest way would be close-in weapon systems, AAA, etc. So close-in. I know there have been American attempts to put CVIS on flatbed trucks, some things like that. All that's needed is AAA to shoot them down from what I've seen. Nothing there was... I'm talking about the suicide drones. The other drones should be bigger and should be easier to detect as well. Okay. I don't know what that comment here was. I guess the mods took care of that guy. Hello, great content. Do you think... what do you think will be the fourth phase of the war after Kiev, Russian refocus, East, HIMARS? Will it be the delivery of the delivery of MTB or the mobilization or something else? I would say the mobilization. Whenever I was asked how this war is going to end and what that offensive means and how this is going to happen, I said, I think the over the last few months, I said after the summer, the Russians will likely have expended their offensive power, the majority of it, and the Ukrainians will have the chance to seize the initiative. But I always said a Russian general mobilization will reshuffle the deck, will reshuffle the card. Now, we officially don't have a general mobilization, even though it might be that in the end, it'll come close to that, just without the Russian government actually declaring it. This is a big deal. If the biggest estimates are right, we might talk about 1.2 million. They will suffer tremendous losses if they are being used as it can be expected. But that's a human wave that first has to be defeated, even though it can be defeated. So I would definitely say the fourth phase is the Russian mobilization. Whether or not the Ukrainians get 100 or 200 Abrams within 3 months is no comparison in the importance for that war to the Russians using their massive manpower. Brainwash, thank you for the support. Yes, that's our little boy. Teat Soul, I'm very impressed with your use of language. You're a very good speaker. How can I get half as good as you? My English was actually fairly bad when I left school. I actually had a D in English when I left school. I succeeded, but not too much. It got this way because I started watching movies in English with English subtitles. So I didn't make the mistakes of watching them in English and put in German subtitles. I had both of them. My knowledge in English, I came from a German school and a Bavarian school, which is supposedly the best, or at least at my time, was the best schools in Germany. The country, and Germany at that time still had some reputation for education as well. I left that. So even while I wasn't good at English, it was probably decent or okay-ish. So I had enough to start with, to watch the videos, and in combination of both seeing what's actually happening, so it allows me to interpret words that I don't understand, combining that with what I hear, and then combining it to read it in the same language allowed me to improve my English within really no time. I think I already turned off the subtitles after like 40 movies or so. I tried actually in times I would stop and rewind to try to pronounce words to get a pronunciation, to improve my pronunciation. But I've reached, as you can all hear, I've reached a point long ago where I don't have to translate anymore. I just think in English. And the funny thing is when I write something, often I know that this word is appropriate here, but I have no idea what it even means. So apparently that combination of watching movies with subtitles helped me to learn the language somewhat like a small child. So I know the what belongs together, which word is supposedly being used as this, and then I have it in my backend. I have no idea how to write it. I have to look it up, and at the same time, I have no idea what the exact German translation is. I just know it belongs there, and almost always it is actually the case. The only disadvantage of this is that occasionally I have to concentrate to use the words which sound very similar. So then obviously see, saw, all of this, like words that are very similar, that'll make it difficult from time to time, because my brain thinks like thinks not in words or not in letters. It thinks in sounds when it comes to English, and then of course it sounds the same more or less when I use a word that sounds the same, but it doesn't mean when I write it it'll be the same pronunciation. Will be the same. It has to be written the same way. But thank you very much, and thank you very much for your support. If Ukraine blocks supplies from getting to Kherson, will they eventually starve the citizens as the Russian military will take the food supplies for themselves? That's probably a distinct possibility. It's obviously highly illegal, as according to the Geneva Convention, the occupying force has to take care of the people being occupied, but that's actually a distinct possibility. But this is guesswork. I mean, there might be some solution, and everything that comes out of it is probably not going to work, because obviously both sides could agree to supply the civilians with food, but then the Russian army will just take the food for itself, enough that to feed itself, and use the room it thus creates in the supply chain to ship in more weapons. So the Ukrainians shouldn't agree to that. They could agree to evacuate the civilians, but the Russians are not going to use that to allow that, because why would they give up their human shields? So yeah, it might become unpleasant. But this is guesswork right now. Would 10 to 20 tactical nukes west of the line Odessa-Kiev effectively end the war with all bridges in Dnieper destroyed simultaneously? As Lukashenko said, Ukraine will be leveled. Tactical nukes have a limited yield. Like you think the transportation hubs. Now, tactical nukes, we need to see, can't really be used on the front line. Their effect is too big and the front lines are too close. Tactical nukes in itself could be used at transportation hubs, as you mentioned with the Dnieper bridges. And maybe if the Ukrainians set up a big staging area here, which is, well, let's say 5 kilometers more or less away from the front line. And I see that I have full screen again. So here, for instance, if they have a line here in Orkiv, a staging area where they are close to the front line, there it could be used. But they can't use it right on the front line. What they can definitely do is use them on transportation hubs. They could try to destroy bridges with it. Would that effectively end it? The question is this: how well can the Ukrainians bridge the Dnieper? Now we need to see that this year, the Russians still cross the Dnieper. They still bring in probably hundreds of tons of supplies every day. And this is under direct fire by HIMARS, under direct fire by Excalibur, long-range 155 grenades. This year is basically out of reach. for the Russians. Yes, they have a few cruise missiles left, but it's not that many. And a pontoon bridge can be fairly easily repaired as long as they have enough pontoons. And I guess they can be jerry-rigged and they can be shipped there. So if the bridges are blown up, you have to keep pounding the pontoon bridges. And you can take every small boat and you can weld 10 boats together and put a platform on top and use them as a ferry. So I actually don't think they can completely cut it off. What could be a problem is the train lines. I'm pretty sure there are ways to create a train line over a pontoon bridge too. And I'm pretty sure you can somehow try to jerry-rig a ferry with trains on it. But that's definitely far more complicated and far less easy. So everything west of the Dnieper would be as normal. The trains would go here, but from then on it would probably be mostly trucks. But I actually don't think they can cut most of the supply if they don't keep pounding it. And most of it will be out of their artillery range. So their only two options are to use their few cruise missiles, which don't destroy everything. It destroys a few pieces of the pontoon bridge, which can be replaced. And 3, 4, 5 hours later, the pontoon bridge is back up again. Or they have to send bombers, which they don't dare doing. So I don't actually think that automatically means the end of the war. Now, what would mean the end of the war if they start a strategic bombing? If they start pounding the big cities and level them with nuclear weapons, the Ukrainians will have no other choice but to capitulate. That they won't take this. Tactical nukes, they might actually keep fighting. Depending obviously also on how much, but I don't think 10 to 20 tactical nukes automatically mean a defeat or a capitulation for the Ukrainians, as hard as it sounds. Wouldn't it be easy and believe for Ukraine to deter Russia in case of a nuclear strike? I mean, they could threaten to strike Russian nuclear power plants with HIMARS, invade, destroy Russia. I don't think Ukrainians really have the means to invade. Easy to and believe for Ukraine. There won't be many nuclear power plants within range of the Ukrainian means. And I don't think they can actually invade Russia in serious. The easy way to deter is the impossible way. That would be the US president talks to both leaders of both parties. They introduce a change in they introduce a law that would allow the United States to hand over nuclear weapons to Ukraine in case it was attacked. Now that would break the non-proliferation treaty, which the US won't do. And even if they hand over nuclear weapons, to be perfectly honest, they are useless, even if they get launch codes and everything, because unless they give them missiles with it, and the only missiles I know of are the strategic missiles in the submarines, and they are land launched. I mean, they might have they deployed strategic missiles again on? Have they deployed nukes again on the Tomahawk? That might be a possibility. But the problem would be if you just give them bombs, they can't just put them on the planes and fly there. But if you want to deter it, that would be the way. Basically, Ukraine should have nuclear weapons today. It didn't because it agreed to give them up and Russia promised its territorial integrity. So if there's ever going to be a country that is justified of getting nukes, it's going to be Ukraine. That has to be clearly said. So under these circumstances, the American government could say, we are not going to give them nukes. But if you use nukes on them first, they will have nukes to strike back. As said, I don't think that's close to possible. Starting from non-proliferation treaties, starting from the US probably being too afraid that they might be struck in a strategic strike in case they do that, and going to the point that the Ukrainians not really have a means to deploy those weapons, to use them. But if you want deterrence, that would be the way to deter it. Chat is discussing about the losses of the Russian fleet. Someone even mentioned most of it is at ground of the Black Sea. And does Russian Navy depend on Moscow? Moscow is mostly an anti-ship weapon, or was. It has, what is it? P-800 Basalt, I think is the name. Extremely, extremely powerful extremely powerful anti-ship missiles that were meant, basically the Moskva was meant to charge into the in the direction of a US carrier fleet in the Cold War, launch its salvo of huge missiles. A few of them will get shot down, but a few of them will get through and sink the US carrier. That's the Moskva's mission. And to allow for that, and to allow for the guys around it to operate, it had an S-300 air defense system. Not as powerful as the land-based ones, but a fairly good air defense system. So the Moskva was helpful in the Black Sea for air defense. And air defense in a way also means defense against anti-ship missiles and against cruise missiles. So it was a strong ship. But I don't think the air defense, the capabilities of its air defense are the decisive factor. What we have now is a concentration of anti-ship missiles that were given to the Ukrainians to a degree that they now can effectively overwhelm the defensive, and the terrorist is coming again. Anna, can you please pick him up? I have to get rid of that cute boy. Oh, wait, he's coming to my lap. Maybe we can wait for a moment. So I can... the number of air defense of anti-ship missiles that are now in Ukrainian hands those are the ones, and they would be able to overwhelm an air defense system anyways. But the Moskva was an anti-ship weapon first and foremost. It didn't even have anti-land cruise missiles, unless its anti-ship missiles had a secondary air defense capability, a secondary ground strike capability. Scratched me. So I don't think the Moskva was the decisive ship. And the majority of the Black Sea fleet is not on the ground. They sank a few smaller ships. I think one corvette might have sunk. I don't completely know. They sank one landing ship and the Moskva. And the rest was like tugs, patrol boats, stuff like this. At least as far as I remember. And they still have their submarines. They still have several surface combatants. If you could immediately add one thing to Ukraine army, what would it be? Abrams tanks, Bradleys, F-16s. Well, obviously the air domain has the biggest impact if you actually gain superiority. So if I could give them something and it would come with supplies, maintenance, mechanics, operators, obviously it would be planes. Maybe F-15, F-16 or F-15, or maybe F-18, so they can land them on roads like the Finnish do, where they use the tail hook that is meant for aircraft carriers to hook themselves up to allow them to use shorter runways. Something like this. And then give them a few hundred of those so they actually gain air superiority. F-18s together with Growlers, that could make a difference if they have also enough precision ammunition. But as I said, it's completely out of reality. John Pierce, thank you for the support. What type of quagmire does this conflict become long-term? A negotiated DMZ in Ukraine, an unending proxy like Syria, or a Russian defeat that results in Putin's regime collapsing? Generally, this war will end with a military victory of one side, unless it's lasting for long enough that both sides, and that's important, both sides come to the point where they say it's impossible for us to achieve a win. We need to find a way to stop the fighting. So this war will last for quite a long time additionally, unless Russia is deploying nuclear weapons. Because even if it's 1.2, they are not going to overrun 1.2 million. They're not going to overrun the Ukrainians within a few weeks, even if they regain the initiative with it, which I think they probably will, at least for the time being. And then both sides, as of now, have still not given up their goals. So Putin would not mobilize to that degree. And as of now, it feels more likely that the 1 million is probably true than 300,000 to me. As I said, I don't have proof. But he would not mobilize if he wouldn't like to win. There would have been a small option for a negotiated peace, actually. So if you are in a war and you are currently losing, and Russia was losing the last few days, you can't negotiate peace. You negotiate surrender if you're currently losing. So by threatening nuclear weapons, by threatening annexation, and by mobilizing, Russia actually is improving its position on the negotiating table. I would not be surprised if we find out in a future point that right now they're having serious debates, serious peace negotiations, serious ceasefire negotiations. Erdogan also said he thinks Russia might be willing to negotiate its settlement, but he thinks. That doesn't mean that's true. Obviously, that ship sails as soon as the annexation is through. I can't imagine Russia giving up territory again that it just annexed, at least not without being forced to. So there might be a settlement until maybe the end of the coming week, maybe Friday or something, for a sudden settlement that might surprise us, but I would not expect it to. Other than that, I would expect the fight to continue. I would expect the battles to continue, and I don't see any negotiated solution anytime soon. The DMC, what you're saying, would be an option for the point where both sides have exhausted themselves to a point where they think we are far from being defeated, but we simply can't go on. No ways. And I think we are away from that at least by a year, if not longer. So I would not expect that anytime soon. Thank you for your support, though. And Putin's or a Russian defeat that results in Putin's regime collapsing. So Russian experts I listened to said that he might actually even survive a Russian defeat if he realizes it early enough. Because he could claim, or at least he was able to claim, that he denazified Ukraine because he had all the Azov fighters. Now he returned them. Oops. He could claim that he demilitarized Ukraine because Russian armed forces destroyed so much in Ukraine, so much military equipment. And he could claim that he achieved Ukraine's neutrality because Ukraine cannot possibly join NATO while parts of it are occupied by Russia. So that would have allowed him for a way out. But in general, I can't really say. The feeling would be a dictator like him will not survive the fall of a defeat, but that's not really fully my expertise. So I can't really say. I think we will see a military solution of this war, which then obviously leads to a negotiation. But the preconditions for that negotiations will be a decisive military advantage for one side or a complete exhaustion by both sides. I hope that answers it. Okay, what? Do you think that destroying supply depots is a winnable strategy for Ukraine? And why we hear almost nothing about Ukrainian depots being destroyed? Now, the Russians occasionally claim they also destroy some. The Russians have an issue, though, that they claim so much that nobody believes them anymore. Now, they might destroy them, and likely they do occasionally. But if we see the numbers they claim what they have destroyed, I think they have destroyed what... Now, I probably exaggerate here. But they might claim that they have destroyed like 200 Bayraktar by now, which is probably more than exists in the whole world. So the Russians have so big claims that whenever they say they destroyed a supply depot, I don't really care. First of all, I think occasionally they will probably do it. And secondly, that's not something I see that's worth reporting. Like I don't report individual Russian depots being destroyed anymore. And thirdly, I think I was at 2. Thirdly, I think it's a high chance of it being more fantasy from the Russian side. For Ukraine, it's actually an important step. Russia, until now at least, was not using its manpower, its potential of manpower, but mostly its potential in artillery. And artillery that doesn't have shells is scrap metal, nothing more. And the firm's satellite pictures showed the moment the Ukrainians started destroying supply depots, the artillery fire was diminishing. HIMARS has such a huge range that either you have to risk your ammo depot being destroyed, or you have to push it so far back that the supply trucks can only do 1, maybe 2 routes per day to resupply the front line. That means there are far less shells coming to the front line. That means the Russia's biggest advantage, which is its firepower, its sheer amount of artillery, is being reduced, as an artillery piece without shells is useless. And that's why we saw a visible effect on the satellites and saw it from the front lines. That's why one thing that helps the Ukrainians attack here in Kherson, that the Russians can't just fill it up with artillery and pound it to shreds. And that's why the Russians themselves, I think Raiba, the pro-Russian Telegram channel, said that the war so far has 3 phases, as it was mentioned before by one of the commentators. We have the phase where the initial phase, basically the Kiev phase, where they were around Kiev. The second phase was the redeployment and then the Donbas offensive. And the third phase was the appearance of the HIMARS. Do you believe Russia still realistically expects to take Mykolaiv and then Odessa to reach Transnistria, considering they are visibly not willing to retreat on the Kherson front? Now, this is a good question because it basically enters the realm where we see Putin giving orders like Hitler to the military. Here we see the discrepancy between military needs and political needs. The military might want to retreat behind the Dnieper because their supply is definitely in trouble. They might still be more or less getting enough, but it's not a pleasant situation and it's a risky situation. So the military would definitely love to consider going back. But there comes the political problem, as it's close to impossible to cross the Dnieper again under fire once it's lost and the other side is prepared. Giving up Kherson means giving up Mykolaiv and Odessa, and Putin is not willing to do that because that would be nothing short of a strategic defeat inside of, like, a strategic loss in this war. It wouldn't decide the war by itself, but it would make sure, or almost sure, like there's always a 5% chance that the Russians just grab every boat they can get and just simply accept to lose 40,000 men by trying to cross the river. Like, you know, some D-Day style where the first wave is losing 95% of its soldiers. That's always a theoretical possibility, but by normal measures, it's over. They will never cross the Dnieper again once they lost it, which means they will never get Mykolaiv and Odessa, as the Black Sea's fleet is more or less neutralized, both through losses as well as through the strength of the Ukrainian ASM, the anti-ship missiles. And that would admit and accept that this area is never being controlled. Now, why is this area important? Not only is Odessa a majority Russian-speaking city, this also, so it would be giving up one of the claims that to liberate the Russian people, the Russian-speaking people there. If you want to choke Ukraine, you need to make sure that you control the coast. Ukraine has a lot of agricultural fields, they have resources, they have industrial production, at least unless it's destroyed. But they can't export it unless they do it by ship. Now, of course, you have roads and you have some railroads, but all of this, what I mentioned, most of it is big in volume. So big in volume means one truck transports relatively little, and trains also have a limited capacity. To transport bulk, you need ships to do it economically viable. If Russia controls the coast, it can either blackmail Ukraine or it can starve it. There is no option for Ukraine but to export by ship in the long run. You cannot build an alternative because trains will always cost much, and there is simply no other way for the Ukrainians to export their stuff. And if Russia wants to make sure they can choke the Ukrainian state for as long as they want, they need full control over the coast. So Putin cannot give this up unless he wants to admit a strategic defeat, which Kherson would mean. That's why I am convinced they will fight tooth and nail. The only reason to retreat from Kherson would be that they are about to lose it and they don't want to lose 10,000 prisoners. Other than that, I would expect them to fight and keep fighting. And if the Ukrainians gain ground here, they will rush in reinforcements, barely trained. We've seen fresh volunteer groups appearing here. We've seen them send in reinforcements after the bridges have been destroyed. So after there should be resupply problems, they were still pumping in troops. Because this is one of the most important battles of this whole war. Loss of Kherson basically means loss of one of the main goals of the Russian side for this war. Okay, I think I already answered that. Okay, apparently I missed that question, and by luck I found it again. Okay, the others are already answered. Some say that the referendum only makes sense in case Russia plans to use tactical nuclear weapons. Do you agree to that theory? It has some other advantages too for Russia. First of all, it might galvanize support. Yes, Russia got bigger. Secondly, it will de jure, so by law, allow Russia to use conscripts here. Because conscripts can be used in Russian territory. So they can use them in the back areas to control. They might even use them to guard the front line. There might be an issue sending them into offensive operations to charge. Because Chechnya, after Chechnya, they said that those things should only be done by professionals, and Chechnya is still within Russia. So I'm not completely sure about that, but they can definitely deploy conscripts there, because then it's, according to Russian understanding, it's inside of Russia. That is one thing. The second thing is, obviously the doctrine would allow the use of nukes. The third thing is the threat of using nukes might deter international support for Ukraine, whether they actually plan to use it or not. That we are talking about nukes all the time shows how the Russian nukes are being a factor being put in play with this. And obviously that's a huge advantage to Russia that now we have to tiptoe when it comes to our support for Ukraine. All of this is an advantage. And I think I missed one. I forgot one. And next thing, they can recruit the men here. So they can force Ukrainians and throw them into Russian uniforms and can throw them into the Ukrainian machine gun fire. Another advantage, so no Russian soldiers, no Russian citizens are dying from that. And there was one thing more, which I have forgotten by now, because I talked about it in the past, but I'm sorry. The last option I forgot. So I don't think this is one theory of explanation, but it's far from being the complete range of options for the annexation. With Russia no longer a great power, how will the geopolitics in Asia change? Please elaborate new alliances, interests in regards to all 8 regional powers. I'm not sure I can get all 8 regional powers, but Central Asia, the stance will be drawn into China's influence. Mongolia will have a hard time of balancing between Russia and China, and thus actually getting cozy relations with NATO. We shouldn't forget that Mongolian troops have been in Afghanistan under NATO command. They actually set up something here where they try to keep good relations with the West to balance it, without the one side being a potential partner to play against the Chinese. Mongolia will be under pressure as well. Kazakhstan is threatened with Russian national interests because it has a sizable Russian-speaking minority and ethnic Russian minority, and it gives access to the mountains here, which is one of the strategic geographic barriers that hinders invasions into the Russian heartland, into the Russian flat areas. So Kazakhstan is highly threatened, and unless they want to go and be a Russian vassal, even when Russia is collapsing, they have to look for elsewhere, and then they need to secure themselves, so they will fall into Chinese influence, and they will actively seek it. Because China will most likely be absolutely content with buying Kazakhstan's resources, while it protects them, as Kazakhstan would give China the huge advantage. If Kazakhstan actually reroutes most of its fossil fuels, so oil and gas, China will probably not be independent. I would have to calculate it. But one of the arguments against China is China can't afford a war because it needs its oil and gas that's coming from the Persian Gulf. And it goes through the straits here, Malacca, I think that's Lombok. But through those straits here, which can easily be blocked, by Allied submarines. Now, if they get a significant amount of fossil fuels from Kazakhstan, they have more independence, more leeway to act in this regard. The smaller ones basically have no choice but to decide once Russia is done between China and maybe Iran. Armenia is utterly effed. I know I have to not pronounce that, even though that doesn't make much sense to me as a German, but I'm going to respect American sensibilities. Armenia is more or less a vassal of Russia, and Russia is collapsing. Russia's power is collapsing. There are only two options. It can hope for the West, and the West will, if it has the choice between Armenia and Turkey, will always choose Turkey for its strategic importance. So the only option it has to hope that somehow Iran is going to protect it. And Iran is an international pariah. So that's, if everything goes well, then Armenia will be hated by everyone but still existed. Armenia is utterly in trouble. Turkey will try to extend its influence, but we'll have to see how far that's even further possible, because Turkey might have already overextended. If we think about the adventures Erdogan is doing, he's meddling everywhere, which is fairly impressive because he does it with certain effect. But what isn't talked about are the long-term effects. If you meddle militarily in every other country in the region, at some point you're hated by everyone, and then you are in trouble. And Turkey might be on the way to do that. So, the stance here, I think India will just have to rearrange. I think mostly India is on Russia's side for military reasons, and of course for tradition. I mean, Soviet Union was a friend of India for basically all of its existence, and if you have cordial relationships for 70 years, that's being like expected that you're nice to each other. But they might orient towards the US, which is probably also their only hope for. Or at least the Europe and the US. So we are seeing we will see a massive shift. Then we can talk about China being about to demographically collapse. So I don't think this can easily be being said in one response, as it's so multi-layered, and you have to consider everything. I'm talking about the Chinese importance, but China has a lot of internal troubles as well. So I'm afraid I can't probably fully reply to that question, but obviously Russia's lack of influence will have significant results in all of its borders. Around its borders, Belarus as well will be threatened that the government will fall. What difference will make cold weather gear in winter, and will Russia have a problem to equip 1 million soldiers? You would expect they have a problem, but you would expect it's too early to know. Now, when we see those weapons here, we might expect they might have winter clothing, but it's probably falling apart by now. But that's a guess. We should wait until we do it. We should definitely not discount it until we see it. When we see the Russian soldiers capitulating, switching sides because they're freezing to death and they rather be in Ukrainian prisoner of war, because before freezing to death, we can assume that this is a serious problem, but we shouldn't praise the day before the evening. Would you consider Latin America a part of the West? Has Latin America any influence in this conflict? Samuel P. Huntington doesn't consider Latin America a part of the West, and if we see the culture of it, I don't think it is. Latin America might be Christian, mostly Catholic, but its culture is distinctively different than the conventional West. Does it have any influence in this conflict? I don't see a big one. I see it makes some difference that they don't partake in the sanctions. If you see Bolsonaro even flying to Putin, meeting him, it would obviously help if Latin America would stand on the side of the West. But then again, we see why it doesn't. We see that it doesn't. So they show that they are not as involved, that morals, that what's right, etc. In this regard, they see it differently, or in this case, they just don't bother enough. Do they have any influence? I don't see how they would. Could the attempt to use nuclear weapons cause a refusal and possible coup against Putin? Could. Obviously, it could. How likely is that? I have no idea. Not my field of expertise. How much do we really know about Russian tactical nukes? I actually don't know that crazy much. Like, I know that they have a lot, but which specific types? I know that actually, I don't really know that crazy much. I know that the tactical nukes obviously is a low yield weapon because its use is not to destroy a whole area, but to create maximum damage at a specific point. But I then again, how much? What in which regard? In the way of deployment, whether they are available, whether they might actually be rusted to pieces or something. So the question is pretty general. But I have to say my knowledge also reaches a limit at some point. I can explain to you the effect of tactical nukes and the dangers of radiation, but I cannot explain you the different types of Russian tactical nukes without specifically looking them up. Is there any restrictions on what type of offensive weapons other countries can give to Ukraine? Basically what their governments mandate and what their population mandates. And of course, then you might say international treaties. So if you have a treaty that forbids you, if you've signed a treaty and ratified it that doesn't allow you to hand over nuclear weapons, then you probably shouldn't. But while the US might not be happy if somebody supplied it with short-range or medium-range ballistic missiles, I don't see a way how they could prevent it. They would try political pressure if they try to. But if Turkey, for instance, has missiles with range of several hundred kilometers, ballistic missiles, if I remember correctly, and Turkey has supplied Ukraine with 200 armed vehicles. So if they were to supply them ballistic missiles, US would try and back channels to avoid that, but there is not really anything stopping them, I see, unless they bow to US pressure. Could you please summarize your current predictions for the end of the war? What are the most likely military endpoints and who's most likely going to win? Sorry, easy to ask, hard to answer. The war is going to end through political solution, obviously, like every war is being, or I'd say 99.9% of all wars are being ended with a political solution, basically somebody signing. But the preconditions are being set militarily. Unlike other wars, there are some wars where military, there's no decision, where it's not even close to a military decision, and it's still being ended immediately. But this war will be decided on the battlefield. That's my prediction, because the differences in the positions, what they are negotiating about, are so vastly different that meeting halfway is close to impossible. The only way it is not by a full military decision is that both sides are exhausted, but we are far, far away from that. I think destruction of enemy units will be more important than gaining territory. If the Ukrainians lose 50,000 men in one area, it'll hurt them much more than if they lose Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So the destruction of enemy forces. In Russia, it'll lead to increased mobilizations, increased dissent, and increased intention to get rid of Putin. In Ukraine, it'll lead to pressure on the government at some point to end this war that we can't win, where so many of our countrymen die. The endpoints, the war will end before Russia reaches Poland and before Ukraine reaches the Strait of Kerch. That would be my expectation. Because if Russia is getting defeated to a point where the Ukrainians might actually reach the Strait of Kerch, any sane Russian government will try to get a settlement that allows it to keep some face and stay in power, or they will use nukes. So this is more or less it right now. I think that's a as short as possible answer without getting while actually giving an answer. While this would probably warrant a 30-minute video in itself with all the options. Could you, yeah, that was it. If USA gives Ukraine ATACMS, what will they make a difference? They should. 300-kilometer range allows the destruction of Kerch Bridge. It allows attacks on transport hubs, probably Voronezh. I'm pretty sure it's within 300 kilometers. Yes, even further actually. It allows attacks on airfields. We see here. They could go for those airfields, for instance. Lipetsk is fully in range. They can destroy bridges. They can destroy tunnel entrances. They can destroy dams. The Ukrainian potential to destroy staging grounds. In Rostov, supposedly they are setting up this an improvised tank factory, which is not actually going to produce tank, but to repair them, to do maintenance, and likely to get stored tanks up into running order again. That's a fairly compact target then that could be destroyed, including a lot of specialized workers in it that have education that can't be easily replaced, etc. So yeah, attack MS would be a massive gain in capability for the Ukrainians, and that's why the US is so hesitant of handing them over, because it would definitely be an escalation in the help. Would it be dangerous to recruit Ukrainians in mass? Partisans would likely get good information and turn battalions against Russia. The thing is that it actually fairly well works, because to switch sides, there will be people fairly early trying to go over out of the trench to the other side with raised heads. That won't end well. I would expect the Russians to simply shoot them in the back. Once that happened twice, it won't happen again. After that, the forces basically only have a choice to mutiny, to kill their officers, and then turn sides with their complete unit or kill everyone else. And the Ukrainian soldiers have the threat of their own guys shooting them from the front and of somebody behind them shooting them, and you can limit that threat to a certain degree. You can give 10 Ukrainians and 2 Russian soldiers, and the Russian soldiers are the one that have magazines. So they don't have any ammo while they're in the trench. You only give them ammo once they are supposed to go over the top towards the enemy, or once the enemy is storming ahead. And at that point, you can expect them, you have a decent chance of them shooting at the guy who actually shoots at them, and not at the guy who just gave them ammo. So it wouldn't be the first time that it's successful to press occupied people into your own army. And it goes fairly well for a certain time. Now, it has to be well managed, and it'll cause problems, because they will at times kill their own officers and try to, in a case when they were handed the guns, reload them and shoot the Russians surveilling them, to then raise their arms. And sometimes it'll work, and other times the Russians will shoot them before they turn their weapons. All of this will likely happen in a case like this, but in the end, it's a cost-benefit ratio. And if you use it wisely, if you basically throw the Ukrainians out and tell them, if you don't march forward, we're going to shoot you in the back. And you could, in theory, even give them unloaded rifles. And when they raise them or when they drop them, you shoot them. So you hope the Ukrainians open fire and show their own positions with that. So there are various options where, if you're brutal enough, if you're cynical enough and don't care about international law, you could use forced recruits as well. I hear that 10 million Russians have left Russia since the war began. Will this have a telling effect on mobilization, and will the ethnic minorities put up with their overuse as military? I'm pretty sure 10 million is vastly overstated. The last number I heard was 500,000, and that was like a week ago. So maybe we're closing in on 600-700, maybe 800. But I would be surprised if we have crossed 1 million. Maybe we've crossed 1 million. Will this have a telling effect on the mobilization? Probably not. Not immediately. I mean, of those fleeing now, which are probably in the end a few 100,000, maybe 100,000, most of those fleeing now are likely potential recruits. But that still leaves 10 million others to choose from. So it's not going to have a significant effect. On the economy, it will have an effect because the smart guys flee faster. Those who speak different languages are less likely to be influenced by the government, as they have different choices to get information. So they are likely more in the opposition than those who only speak Russian. And usually, if you speak more languages, in Europe at least, you're I mean, it's a sign of education to speak more than one language. So those who speak more than Russian are highly likely also in better jobs. So they might be the engineers, the doctors, the programmers. Those are the ones that are fleeing. All of this will harm the Russian economy, but will it cripple it? I don't see it coming yet. And with the ethnic minorities, it's too early to tell. I already said it, that it's basically trying to breed separatist movements. You can accept to be a national minority inside of another country. Also, if you're being treated well enough, or B, if you think that leaving it doesn't make much sense, or C, if you're too afraid to leave. But what we have now is that the national minorities are increasingly learning that Putin might say some nice words. We all know that from his first speech after the war began, where he said, like, didn't he say like I'm a Tatar now and I'm a Chechen now or something like this? Like basically he praised all the national minorities. And once they learned that this was cheap talk and that they actually have to bear the blunt of the brunt, I think, of the fighting, of the bleeding, it should create separatist movements. Because if my central government that is from another ethnicity is using me in the meat grinder, is using me as cannon fodder to save its own people, then I don't see a point in staying in their country. So it should have an effect. Would the Black Sea control a game changer for Ukraine? So would it be a game changer? Doesn't really matter because they won't. They won't get the ships to do that. And there's no way for that to get them in. So it's not really, obviously, allowing them to do amphibious invasions behind the coast, allowing them to interdict the transport, the supply lines over the Kerch Strait, all of this would be a massive advantage for the Ukrainians. But it's not going to happen, so we don't really need to go too much into detail here. There's no way of them achieving supremacy and control of the Black Sea. Is the West making a strategic mistake by preventing Russian draft dodgers from entering the countries? Maybe. I said it fairly early in the war that Europe should entice Russians to give themselves up. We are reaching a point now, though, where among those draft dodgers would be FSB agents, GRU agents, and then suddenly the gas pipelines would probably blow up. That's a distinct possibility too. It's a question of measuring. Like, to be perfectly honest, my empathy for them is somewhat limited. They had a chance to do something against it for the last half year, and many of them probably had the Z scribbled on their car. And now it's where they are forced to put their money where their mouth is, they are rather running away. If we see the support for the military operation before the mobilization was at 70%. Among the younger, it was a little lower, but we could probably expect that 60% of those mobilized supported the war. So they had chances to leave before, to run away before. They had chances to try overthrowing the government or forcing it to give in. There were a couple of thousand Russians, maybe tens of thousands nationwide, that were taking the risk of protesting against the war. They have all my respect, but the majority of the draft dodgers likely have done nothing. They might have even cheered any Russian military advance. So from an empathy point, I don't really care. From a military standpoint, obviously, weakening your enemy is of higher priority. When we think that the alternative for them would be to be killed, then that would be the argument for internment. By international law, if a military armed force is crossing the border into a neutral country, it has to be interned, which means you take away their guns and you put them into camps until the war is over. Now, you treat them nicely. You might even allow them to leave the camp at certain hours to go to the bar or to go to the supermarket to do sports. Like, you don't have to treat them like prisoners, like full prisoners. But it's absolutely fine if you put them in camps with barbed wire around and guard them. Now, if we say that the Russians might actually be used as cannon fodder in human wave attacks, I hope this is not insensitive saying this as a German, but, and I know my history, But if they are fleeing and threatened with their lives, allowing them for 2 years in a secured area where they can't flee from, well treated, well medical supply, maybe even allowing them to work over the internet if the internet is surveilled. I mean, you would have to check for FSB agents or something, but interning them might be a valid opportunity. And then you can talk to third countries, like whatever, Latin America, Africa, Asia, who takes them. Like, it's not that we have to imprison them for however long that war lasts. But if they flee, they could be interned, and then you could check and ask if, I don't know, Namibia is taking 500 of them. Okay, so 500 are on a plane or on a ship. And maybe Vietnam. Now, Vietnam has good relations with Russia. They might hand them over. But maybe Thailand allows 5,000 to come in. So you put 5,000 there. Things like that. You don't have to put them in camps, and let alone calling something concentration camps. No. But it would weaken the Russian military if you let them out. But there's some risk involved too. And it has to be mentioned that we have Dodgers now that didn't care enough to do anything while the war still raged in Ukraine, while Ukrainians were dying and Ukraine was being bombed. They didn't care enough. So from a political and a military standpoint, it makes sense to help them dodge the draft. But that's it. With winter coming and Russia mainly using railroads, will it not be a disadvantage for Russia to have so many troops, easy targets? The railroads you have to be able to hit the railroads, and the Ukrainians can't really. They have 80-kilometer range HIMARS, which is precise, but its effect on a bridge is limited, as we have seen on the Dnieper, how often they had to hit them to even make them collapse. The effect on a train line somewhere in the field will be limited, and the damage is so easy to repair that it's an absolute waste of usage. And that is with like 80-kilometer range. Everything further cannot be touched, as the Ukrainians can't afford to fly their few remaining planes into Russia to bomb something. And to have a real effect, they would have to see the train coming. They would have to observe it and hit it, and they don't really have the proper tools for that, unless they do it with Bayraktar. And that is also limited in usage now, mostly to the areas where they spam basically the area with harm to take out the Russian air defense. So I don't see that being a big issue, especially as they are prepared for that. That's their main doctrine, to keep them supplied by train. Ukraine's not planning to become a NATO state even after the war, right? I can't remember. I think Zelensky offered this as a negotiation point during the negotiations in Minsk in March. But it's still in the constitution. And as far as I know, there is no process on the way to change that. So officially, Ukraine is aiming to come into NATO. Isn't it part of NATO charter that a country cannot become a member whilst at war? And I believe Zelensky said it was not what he wanted. He asked for security guarantees. The security guarantees is his admission that he won't join NATO anytime soon. And it's Article 10 in the NATO that says any country joining NATO has to improve its security. And how it would improve NATO security if Ukraine would join while at war against the biggest nuclear power? Well, I guess we all have the answer. And that's also why that whole war was unnecessary. Because after 2014, it was impossible for Ukraine to join, as it would never improve NATO's security to allow a member state that has territorial claims and a territorial dispute that it is still considering for a military solution with Russia. So Ukraine was never up for join. So the whole war is completely unnecessary. Ukraine was not going to join NATO. If you take this as a rational argument. I have to take a quick break to drink something. I'll be back in 30 seconds. Okay, so okay, thanks for the. What could be a possible target for a warning nuke from Russia? Snake Island was mentioned, but the problem with Snake Island is it's 40 kilometers from the Romanian coast. And while with a tactical nuke that will not create a fatal radiation dose, it will definitely cause visible radiation hit. Like if there are beachgoers here, they will be hit with radiation. That's no doubt about it. Fallout will hit Romania. None of this is going to uh, be enjoyed by a NATO member, Romania, which doesn't really speak for Snake Island as a likely target. So maybe something in central Ukraine, somewhere here in the fields. That seems to be a smart choice in this regard. If you take whatever here, you have 2 kilometers. Like you have even hills here in between. So if you don't do an air burst but a ground burst and take some valley, you might end up with 200 people dead, not more, depending on where you use it. That should be more enough than warning. Mobilization will cause other problems. Workers missing, main earners gone. For example, the 2000ers have only around 240,000 males. How long can Russia endure this mobilization? This is going to be the last major war of Russia. Russia is ending itself. We just have to say it like this. Russia wasn't really a great power outside of the fact that its military supposedly was number 2 in the world, that it has nukes, and that it is in the Security Council. Now it still has nukes and it's still in the Security Council, but that's it. And it's now, as I said, 1.5 reproduction rate, and they're killing off those that never had children before while sending them at war. This is going to be Russia's last major war. At least the data points to that. Because at some point there will simply be riots because somebody from Siberia doesn't want to die on a field like this when there's nothing to gain. So how are they going to... How long can Russia endure this mobilization? As long as the government can force the people to. Supposedly they can for a long time. But I'm no Russia expert, especially not when it comes to internal cohesion, the real power of the government or things like that. I simply can't really say that. Do you agree that no matter the outcome of the war, Russia will always be on the losing end due to irreversible economic damage? It will take decades before Europe wants to do business again. I actually have a video prepared, it's not recorded yet, where I'm saying that no matter the military outcome, Russia has already lost the war. I don't want to spoiler it too much, but you can see that at least in the basic general direction, I already agree with you, even though I'm focusing more on different points. What is the geopolitical interest of the US providing military support for Ukraine? You have some altruistic point that you defending the small one against the big one, and everyone supports the underdog. But the real interest is in this regard. Now we can talk about the gas, that the big natural gas that was discovered here, and Russia is taking it. But then you'll have people saying that the US want to sell LNG gas to Europe and get out, make Europe switch from Russian gas to US LNG gas. But I think that's too easy, and that would not justify this. What the point is here, that Russia has shown itself to be an aggressive, revisionist, autocratic, imperialist power. It has already shown it with 2008, but at that time the majority didn't see it, and probably Mitt Romney did, or he had luck. But some of you will remember the debate against Obama where he said next they're going to invade Ukraine. And I think Obama's response was the Cold War has called and wants his policy back. Now, since then, 2014 happened, and here at least, Russia didn't annex anything yet. They helped them declare independence, which is questionable, but someone might have said, well, it's not that different from Kosovo. Actually, it was different, but I understand why somebody would argue this. But what we have in 2014 is Russia breaking international law and opening basically Pandora's box by militarily doing a military expansion of its own territory. Crimea was annexed because Russian troops took it over. Nothing else. There might have been a majority among the population to actually join Russia. There might have been. But the referendum was far from fair. There was no resemblance of a fair referendum. Russia military expanded its territory. That is absolute breaking of a taboo and its opening of Pandora's box. And Venezuela basically claims, you see, this is only a dashed line because it's internationally disputed. As far as I know, Venezuela claims everything until here, basically more than half of Guyana. Now here, obviously, the US would probably intervene. But who would say, I don't know, any other country that has territorial claims? If Russia can do it and the US don't care and they aren't there, why not try it here? The next thing is, whatever you see the reason, it's not ending with Ukraine. If it's the NATO threat, NATO is still up here. It's still 100 kilometers or 150 or whatever it is from St. Petersburg, which is one of the two basically capitals, 128, one of the two capitals of Russia. So this is still a thorn in Russia's side, even after they take over Crimea. They still have to get rid of this. If you talk about strategic depth, then they need the geographic barriers. Then they need to get into Romania to get all of the Carpathians and at least reach the Bessarabian Gap. In that case, they also need to get rid of the Baltics and conquer them. So wherever you see you have Russia, this will not be Russia's last war if they are able to win it easily. So what you can do now is to make sure that even if Russia wins, they are no longer capable of doing another war. And that's one argument where some are arguing, and there is some suspicion that the weapons that are being delivered to Ukraine are actually not enough for Ukraine to win. They are just to keep Ukraine from losing. And if we are completely cynical, but at the same time completely open, and everyone who knows my stream knows that I don't hold back when I have something like this to say, it's actually in NATO's interest. Even like winning it might create the risk of nuclear weapons. But if Ukraine manages to bleed out Russia, to have Russia suffer immense attrition, it's fantastic for NATO too, even if Ukraine wins in the end. Even if Ukraine loses in the end. Because every tank that is killed, that is destroyed by Ukrainian soldiers, every Russian man, every Russian soldier that is killed by Ukrainian soldiers will never ever cross another country's border. So even if Ukraine in the end has to accept the loss of the Donbass and Crimea and maybe even Zaporizhia and Kherson, it's still a win for the West. If the war took 5 years and the Russian army is no more. So this is the US interest. It's in the interest of not just the US, it's of the rest of Europe as well. And the thing is, the Ukrainians are well aware of that. When you listen to what they said in the past, they said, we are not just fighting for us, we are fighting for you too. They are well aware that Russia will not stop. And they argue with it for support. So this is just the hard fact, and that shows the interest. It's you can find some economic interests too, and sure, they might play a minor role. But the support here is to take out an aggressive opponent that is willing to use force to expand its territory. And the other effect of that would be, once the Russians have given up, once the Russians... Anna, I'll need you again. That little boy is still trying to destroy everything. Thank you. Once Russia is defeated to the point that they can't attack anyone else anymore, they're at the same time a useless partner for China. And China is geopolitically, when we're coming to all of the world, China is the much bigger threat than Russia. China has much bigger potency when it comes to threatening the rest of the world and the Western interests. So in this regard, the The US is protecting Europe and thus NATO, and thus prevents its own soldiers from fighting. Basically, this isn't right now. America is defeating Russia without losing a single soldier. Awesome. Absolutely fantastic for the US. And at the same time, it's destroying a potential ally for its biggest geopolitical threat. That's a win-win. And as I said, this is harsh truth, but I guarantee you, everyone who has something to say in Ukraine will be fully aware of that. Thank you, Anna. What do you think about the silence in Kherson and the south? Love the channel, by the way. We don't really know. I think it's an attritional battle. Either the Ukrainians have suffered so many losses that they stopped, or they say we should probably not continue in attrition when the Russians are currently gaining 1 million new men or 300,000, which would also be a logical reason. Or it's just continuing and we don't hear about it. Not really much to say. Or like those are the 3 options I can offer you, not more. We are already at 2:15, so I think I'll limit my. I see like 4 or 5 more questions. I will not accept further questions from now on. My throat needs some rest at some point. Am I the only one that thinks Russian protests are incredibly civil and meager in nature compared to Iran and other life-death situations? This seems odd. What do you think, Thorsten? The thing is this. I think the population is mostly cowed. We've seen protests in Moscow with over a million people. What is it? 8 years ago, something like this. So when Putin faked his re-elections, there was a massive uprising, but it was just brutally suppressed. And then again, a lot of the people, there was still some independent television then. There was still some independent press. And now there's full control over the media. So to be opposing the government, you first need to be aware that something goes wrong. And if that's not being reported, then of course the Russians never have known freedom. That's the next thing. If we look back in time, when have the Russians ever been free? Maybe under Yeltsin, more or less. Putin fastly went over to implement despotism. If you look back, always dictatorship or absolute, more or less absolute monarchy. So the Russians never learned how to be free. That would be another thing. So things like that are in combination, that the majority actually thinks that war is fine. I talked about this in the past. Germany has given up its territorial ambitions. Like Germany lost 1/3 of its territory after World War II. This year, like German border is here, and more or less this year, and this year was Germany. We gave that up. We gave up trying to recover it. Why? Because Germany was defeated utterly and completely. And it taught us to accept both the loss as a price of the defeat and both the horrors of starting a new war trying to regain it. Russia hasn't faced that. Russia, with the end of the Soviet Union, Russia has lost territory that was Russian for the last 300 or 400 years. So for 10 generations or more. And they haven't lost a war. It's not like they got defeated by somebody and learned that this was the price of trying a war and trying to subdue others and getting punished. They actually lost this, in quotation mark, without of their fault. So the Russian population will, to a certain degree, feel a phantom pain. The pain of having lost an empire undeservedly. So that will also help to some degree a support to support that the restoration. All of this probably combined. Then supposedly it's only the reservists and it's mostly the underclass that is serving in the armed forces. So where it counts, they aren't really involved, etc., etc. So there are arguments for that to try to explain while they take it standing and don't rise up. But you have in the past, you've had examples of them rising up for a faked election. Now you would say that when they are being pushed into a war that might, in theory, escalate to a world war, they should rise up in bigger numbers. But I tried to give you an explanation, and I just want to emphasize I'm offering you a process of thought. I'm not saying this is why it is. I'm still no Russia expert. Why would Putin use nukes on Russians, 1 million conscripts? Well, that's one of the arguments why he wouldn't use nukes, because he's claiming that those are basically, the Ukrainians are basically Russians subdued by a Nazi puppet regime of NATO. That was one of the arguments why he's not going to use nukes. If he throws them behind the front line far enough, obviously his own troops won't be directly effective. So he's not going to use them on his conscripts in this regard. How soon do you see Germany providing some truly effective weapon package of weapons, AE tanks? Seems that's it's been dribbled so far. The problem is Germany can't actually deliver that much because it's a long story. German aid hasn't been as unsubstantial as it's usually being called. It's a substantial aid for Ukraine, what Germany has done by giving other nations its weapons, and they give then their Soviet weapons to Ukraine because they can use it far faster. That what is true and what has to be said is that the German arms industry has weapons and doesn't receive a permission to deliver. But officially, the government says we are not going to do it on our own. We are doing it in coordination with our partners, basically saying as soon as others deliver Western IFVs and tanks, so are we. So we will see. If we hear that the the Americans say in 2 weeks that they are going to deliver Abrams, whether the government can still then stand back and prevent the delivery. That's what I can say. If you read the complete data, what was delivered, you see that there was a lot of stuff delivered that isn't as sexy as a battle tank, but still highly effective. For instance, Cobra counter-battery radars, which can be synchronized and connected with the Panzerhaubitze 2000, so the self-propelled howitzer. And supposedly it's basically tells right in the system where the artillery piece is firing from, which should more or less allow the crew to push one button and then it shoots back and destroys the target. Obviously far simplified, but that should be more or less its capabilities. There have been some serious deliveries. Iris-T is a highly potent air defense system. 4 systems are being delivered. 2 of them still this year. So that's also Series 8. Supposedly the Gepard, the anti-air artillery self-propelled tank, played a decisive role to protect the Ukrainian advance here to Kupiansk. There has been 8, but that doesn't mean there shouldn't be more. And it's a shame that the German government doesn't even allow the industry to deliver what it has to spare, because the German armed forces are bare. Everything that's been delivered and is getting delivered, especially when it comes to artillery, is a nightmare for the German army, because that means that German units are not going to train their mission for the next couple of years, because there's no piece to spare and the production rate is so low that it's going to take years until those few items that are being handed over are being replaced, which means that German units at the time where there's a big conventional war within Europe can't train their job. And that's obviously not something great. But yeah, there's far more that should be done. But to some degrees, at least in some ways, there can't be done much more. The military can't really deliver more, and it shouldn't really. Don't forget West Sahara. It came up during the Ukraine debate at the UN yesterday. Did it? I know that Trump made US accept the annexation from Morocco of Western Sahara. And after that, the Polisario, I think is the name, actually did some fighting again, despite there being more or less an unofficial ceasefire for a couple of decades. But I don't think this is going to change much, because it's too weak, and unless Algeria directly intervenes, I don't think there's much going to happen. But we will see. Yeah, it's also definitely a territorial dispute. With Finland joining NATO and having amounts of Soviet weapons, couldn't they receive NATO weapons and troops and give them theirs to Ukraine quite fast? Finland needs reserves, obviously, in case of a war. I don't know how much they actually still have. I know they have T-55, but I think they are only used for training now. I don't know what happened to their T-72s. They might have already scrapped them. If they still have them, obviously, they would be a prime partner to receive Leopard 2s and give Ukraine its T-72s. But I would expect this is already being negotiated if it was actually still an option. Where is it here? Yes, the little saboteur destroying my streams. So yeah, this is an option, but I have to say I don't really know how much is still in Finnish possession. Okay, we've reached the end of the stream. Thank you for supporting it. If you want to support the channel, don't forget to like and subscribe and share the channel with friends and acquaintances. If you want to support the channel, this channel is basically only possible because of viewers like you. If you want to support the channel, you find the options to do so in the description. And yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe, to comment, especially if you see the VOD. It all helps with the algorithm. It all helps the channel to grow. And I will likely be live again next Saturday, but you'll see other situation reports until then. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. Or can I say that? No, I don't think so. Thank you for your time. And that's it for today. But I'll be back.